Thank you very much, as usual, for all of you coming to this. I should mention that this is being videotaped. It goes up on my website, and then it is taken from there and literally circulates now around the world. Just so you're aware that if you say something really strange, people in China are going to hear about it. And you may get an email from somebody that will surprise you. Before we jump into this evening's presentation and the materials we're going to go over, I do want to alert you to next month. We're going to do this every month, as we have done over the last couple of years. And the next one will be on a Tuesday. This is very exceptional. We had a scheduling problem. That's why it's a Wednesday night. This normally happens on Tuesday. And for the rest of this year, it will be only on Tuesdays. So the next one is Tuesday, October 9th. And that will be both an evening presentation, but it will also be a book launching party for this book called Democracy at Work, which was released 2 weeks ago. It's a new book. And so it will be there. I will be signing copies, and you can buy them if you're interested. And it's about the best case I know of how to make that the next step to get out of the crises and the deficiencies of the economic system we have is to really change the way we organize our enterprises, to stop the tradition of an undemocratic system in which a tiny number of people at the top, major shareholders, boards of directors, make all the decisions, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. And that we need to make a transition, that way of organizing our business has produced extreme inequality in our society. You're going to learn more about that tonight. It has now produced a crisis that has hit this economy in December of 2007. So we are now completing the 5th year of this crisis. Everything the government has done to try to deal with it has failed. Everything the governments of Europe have done to try to deal with their similar crisis has failed. You're going to learn more about that this evening as we go through what has happened over the last couple of months since we last met. But something has to be done to get us out of an economic system that works this poorly. And the simplest way to summarize that is to remind you all that we have something on the order of 20 to 25 million Americans that right now either have no job or are working part-time when they want a full-time job, which means they don't either have any work or any income or nothing like the income they need. The Federal Reserve, our central bank in this country, tells us that 20%, 1/5, of all the tools, equipment, machines, raw materials, factory, office, store space, 1/5 of it is sitting empty, gathering rust and dust. So we have an economic system that can't give work to 20 to 25 million people who want it, even though everything is there for them to work with and everything is there for them to work on. If we put 20 to 25 million Americans to work with all the equipment and material means they need, the output of wealth that they could produce would be measured in the trillions of dollars, would be available to solve every one of the social problems we talk about every day, rebuilding destroyed cities, creating daycare centers so that young people with young children could have useful jobs, working jobs, and so forth with that kind of help. Not to speak of what's happening to the elderly part of our population as we become relatively more elderly than we ever have before. So we're in an economic system that can't put the people who want to work together with the tools, equipment that exist to produce the wealth we all know we need to solve our social problems. That's an economic system that doesn't work well. And something has to be done. No more government regulation is going to solve that. No big statements about wonderful futures is solving that. Something has to be done to change the way the decisions are made. All statisticians now will tell you that American corporations are sitting on something on the order of $2 trillion worth of cash. Profits they've made that they've chosen not to invest, because if you ask them, why don't you invest it, their answer is, the economy looks so bad that we're not going to invest money. That would be foolhardy. We're in the business of making money, and we're facing an economy where we can't do that by producing more goods. We're having trouble selling what we produce already. So they're sitting, these boards of directors and shareholders, on what could put everyone back to work. But they're choosing, because it's rational for them in this system to choose not to invest. So in this system, it makes sense to do something that's crazy, that's irrational. When that happens, it's time for reasonable people to question the system. It's not working. It's not producing the results. Last point on this. We as Americans take a certain pride, and I think it's reasonable that we do, that we challenge and question basic systems in our society. We love to debate our educational system. Many parts of America today, we're basically closing down public education and replacing it with charter schools and various forms of private education. That was one of the key issues that sent the public school teachers in Chicago out on strike for the last week and a half. We debate our education system. We just finished 2 years of debating our health system. Should the United States have a national health service that gives everybody health care as a basic human right? Something done in every other industrial country on this planet, except us. So we've had a debate, a little bit of a debate. Maybe we should do what Britain and France and Germany and Canada and so on do. Maybe they've all figured out something which we could learn from. Imagine. So we debated our health system. We debate our energy system. Should we rely more on solar and nuclear or non-nuclear and so on? We've debated we even debate what a marriage is, what sexuality is. Pretty heavy stuff. Do we debate our economic system? Hardly ever. Our Republicans and our Democrats outdo each other to be cheerleaders for capitalism. Why, it's the best thing since sliced bread, maybe even better. It's wonderful. Isn't it great? Isn't it the best? Isn't it the apogee of what humans could achieve? What's this about? If everybody is cheerleading the economic system, then we don't permit as a nation, and that's been true for 50 years, we don't permit a debate. And you know, any institution that gets a pass on criticism, that you're not allowed to question, that you're not allowed to debate the pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses, that's a system that rots behind that kind of protection. It's allowed to indulge its worst tendencies, its worst impulses, because it's safe from criticism. To question or criticize capitalism for 50 years has meant that people look at you as if you're either crazy or ignorant or, lower the music, maybe disloyal to America. Whoa, that's a good way to shut people up. Worked real well. Worked real well. So, for example, I went to school to study economics. I went to undergraduate school, then I went to graduate school, and I ended up with a PhD in economics, which is as much education as you can get. And I went to all the right schools just to get the bestest possible education. I can see from your faces you would like to know, so I'll tell you. I went to Harvard, then I went to Stanford, and I finished up my PhD in economics at Yale. I'm a poster boy for elite education. In those 10 years that I was attended those schools, I was never required to read one word of Karl Marx. Karl Marx, who was and remains the best in the way of criticism of capitalism. That's a lousy education. If you wanted to understand the family that lived down the street from you, for whatever reason, and you knew that there was mama and papa and 2 kids, and you knew further that one of the children thought that the family was wonderful and felt very lucky that they were born into and grew up in that family, but the other one thought it was a pretty dysfunctional family and wished they had lived someplace else. If you wanted to understand that family, would you talk to only one of the children? Or would you think that the logical, reasonable thing would be to talk to the one who loved the family, the one who was critical of the family, and then you make up your own mind? What kind of terror, what kind of irrationality would make you decide, I won't talk to one or the other, whichever one it is? Strange. But we haven't been able to talk critically about our economic system. And we're now paying the price. For example, since no one ever had me read a criticism, I didn't learn about all the things that went wrong with capitalism. So when the capitalism begins to fall apart, I'm ill-equipped. I don't recognize what's happening. I don't know the history of when it happened before, so I can try to come up with the solutions. I'm part of a generation that's now in Washington making all the decisions. And one of the reasons they don't know how to get out of this crisis is because we never studied capitalist crises. We were told that capitalism wouldn't have any more, that we had figured out how to prevent that. Well, if that's what you believe, look how lost you are when we're now in the 5th year. And you'll see more of that as we go along. So I have been working on this problem, and my solution, what makes sense to me, is we've got to change the way decisions are made. We can't have a tiny group of people deciding not to invest because it isn't profitable for them when the cost is an economic disaster for the rest of the population, who are the overwhelming majority. That's not democratic. That's not rational. How are you going to do? You have to change things. And my suggestion, which is contained in this book and which will be the focus of a good part of what we do on October 9th when we meet again, is to argue that we ought to finally bring the value of democracy to our enterprises. If we believe in democracy, that if you are affected by a decision, you have the right to participate in making it, then you have to wonder about the United States, because we've never applied that value or that commitment to industry, to enterprises. If you don't know this yet, let me tell you, when you get a job, you will come to work 8 or 9 in the morning, and you'll do what you're told. They'll tell you what you're going to do, what you're going to work with, what you're going to work on. And when you're done using your brains and muscles to produce things, you go home. And what stays behind is whatever it is you helped to produce. And if you don't grasp that, and if you actually take home what you produced, people in blue uniforms come to your house and they hurt you. And that's how you learn. And who decides what you produce? It'll affect you, you know, what you produce. Do you decide that? Absolutely not. Do you decide what technology to use, what machines not to use, what might be healthy, what not? No. You do what you're told. Do you even decide where the production happens? Do you keep your job in New Jersey because that's where the factory or the office or the store is? Maybe, maybe not. If the board of directors decides to close the factory and move it to China, you lose. And your family loses. And your town loses. Do you have a position on that? Do you participate in making the decision? Not at all. And finally, with the profits that you and your fellow workers' labor produces, do you participate in deciding what's to do with that profit? Whether it's to be invested, creating jobs for people, or not, or invested here, or there, or later, or now. All of those decisions will affect you. You don't participate at all. You have no power at all. The way we organize enterprises in our capitalist system is fundamentally undemocratic. And if democracy is a good value, why wouldn't it apply where you work? You know where you spend most of your adult life? At work. 5 out of 7 days. Most of the day. So if democracy is a value anywhere, it ought to be where adults spend most of their time. Otherwise, you're not serious about this democracy you're talking about. And I think if workers together, and all of this is going to be developed in much greater detail on October 9th, but if all workers together made the decisions, if we democratized our economy by democratizing our enterprises, we would see very different economic outcomes. I'll just give you a couple of examples to tantalize you. If the workers decide where the plant or the office or the store is going to be located, do you think they'll close it, throwing themselves out of work in order to create the job in China? Not likely. Would they use a technology that's bad for your health? Well, if it's a board of directors and capitalists who are far away in New York or Chicago, they might, because it might be profitable to have that technology. So your breathing is a little harder. They're likely to make that decision. Are you likely to make it? I don't think so. Because you got to breathe that, and so do your wife and children and all the rest. Here's another example. If the workers together decided what to do with the profits, do you think the following would happen the way it's happening now? that a huge portion of the profits is given to the 6 highest officials of the enterprise who take home 10, 20, 30, $40 million a year while the rest of you have trouble with your mortgage payments? Unlikely. If you want to do something about the inequality that's widening up in this country, the first and best way to do it would be to change how we distribute the profits in our society to a tiny number of people who get a disproportionate share that you all read about in the newspaper and you shake your heads. But if you want to do something, you got to go to where those decisions are made, and those decisions are made in the way we organize enterprises. So at least let's have a debate over whether this capitalist system, shareholders, a few major shareholders, who pick a board of directors, who make all the decisions, is that what we want? Or do we want an alternative in which your job will henceforth be not only the particular task you do in the office, in the store, in the factory, but you will be part of the decision making. That'll be part of your job description because it's part of every worker's job description. What an interesting alternative. And by the way, it has a long history. The word most usually associated with it is co-op, a cooperative. And such enterprises exist in the United States today, lots of them. And they exist around the world. So part of what we'll do on October 9th is I'm going to take you through a tour of them. I'm going to talk about those that exist in the United States now. I'm going to talk about those that are small, 10, 20, 30 workers, and those that are large, like 120,000 workers, because that's what we got. So there's no need for anyone to wonder, gee, what an interesting idea, but it would never work. I'll describe to you how it's been working real well for a long time. But you have to face that. You have to be willing to think about it. So much for what's going to happen on October 9th. Second announcement before I go in. Some of you have very kindly, over the months and indeed years that we've had this, said that you might like, on occasion, to help pay some of the costs of doing all of this thing. Well, that's now feasible in a way I want to tell you about. There's no pressure here, but there's an opportunity. You go to this place. Some of you have cards, but they didn't give me enough cards. But it's on the cards that many of you got. Those of you who didn't, you just go to this website, indiegogo.com/DAW, that stands for Democracy at Work, CURE, C-U-R-E. That comes from this new book, which will be the discussion topic on the 9th of October, called Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. And if you go to that website, you can make a contribution if you're so inclined. Otherwise, those of you who got the cards, it explained on the cards as well. Last thing. I don't mean to be so self-advertising, but by coincidence, this month was not only the release of this book, which is going to be the focus on October 9th, but also another book that I wrote together with another professor. And this is called Contending Economic Theories, Neoclassical, Keynesian, and Marxian. And this is published and is being distributed now, was released this month, by the MIT University Press up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. For those of you who know something about economics, MIT has been the #1 economics department in the United States for the last 50 years. They decided they wanted to have a textbook that did something different. Instead of just teaching the way economics has been taught, they wanted to confront the student with the fact that there are alternative ways to think about economics, systematic alternative theories. The conventional one, which is called neoclassical economics, that is taught in most American universities. One of the critiques of that, Keynesian economics. And the second major critique of both of them, Marxian economics. This is the textbook that will now be distributed around the United States by MIT Press, which is the prestigious way to do that in this country. And I'm one of the 2 co-authors. And if any of you are interested in a systematic comparison of the alternative economic theories that are fighting it out in the world today, this is the book you might be interested in. Okay, so much for all of that. Let me turn then to what we usually do on these evenings, which is to give you a review of some of the major economic developments, problems, crises, whatever has arisen. Normally at this point I say, since we talked last month, but since we took a couple of months off this summer, it's really now for almost a quarter of a year since we've last done this. So many things have happened, and I'm going to go through a selection of some of the big ones to focus on in the hopes that that will be of interest to you. Well, this spring, the spring of 2012, the newspapers were full, and the politicians even fuller, of the idea that we were enjoying an economic recovery. The word recovery was used over and over again. It had no adjective. It was just the recovery. By the time Obama gave his speech a few weeks ago at the Democratic National Convention, it had morphed into the long road of recovery. Folks, when a recovery develops a new adjective like long road, that's a polite way of saying it isn't happening. So I'm now going to give you the information you probably or should have guessed. The recovery is over. We are now in a period of renewed decline. Okay? For example, over the last 3 days, 2 corporations announced that they're losing money compared to how they were doing a year ago, and that the next 18 months look grim. First company, United Parcel Service. Second company, FedEx. Why would I be wasting your time talking about 2 particular companies? Because they are bellwethers for an economy. You know what those companies do? They're the ones that move the packages. So if a lot of people are buying packages, they're making money. And if a lot of companies are producing goods that they're buyers for, they're making money because they're using UPS and FedEx to ship the products, both here and around the world. So if those 2 companies say, oh boy, does it look bad, that's as good a sign as you ever want to indicate things are looking, but you don't need them. Everybody who looks at the economy, leftist, rightist, man or woman in the middle, sees that we are going back down. And why is that important? Because we never recovered back to where we were before this crisis hit in 2007. Let me give you the most important number. Before the crisis begins, in December of 2007, the official unemployment rate in the United States was 5%. In 2009 and 10, it reached 10%, double. What is it today? 8.5%. That means it didn't ever come back even halfway back to the 5% it was. And 5% is a lot of people, millions out of work. But just use that as a benchmark. We never recovered, but now we're going back down. The unemployment is likely to get worse. There are other signs if you needed them. The Federal Reserve, our monetary authority, announced over the last week that they're going to pump more money into the economy. For those of you that are familiar, I'm going to go over it in a few minutes. The Federal Reserve is the institution that decides, literally, how much money is in your wallet, your wallet, your wallet, how much money is circulating. Some of you are mystified by how this is done. You shouldn't be. They make a simple decision. If they think, the Federal Reserve, if they think the economy needs more money, they have more money printed, and they circulate it, and that's how it's there. And if they decide that there's too much money in the economy, they pull the money out and chop it into little bits. Part of that is used to make a big fire, and the other part is used to fill those little glass jars that you overpay for in a tourist trap. Okay? But there's no mystery. There's nothing complicated or difficult about this. We are afraid in our society that the monetary dependence we all have could be abused. And so we create a special institution, the Federal Reserve, hope like hell it doesn't abuse it, and give them the authority to determine how much money it is, which they basically do. So the Federal Reserve announced this last week that they're going to increase the money supply again. That's the 3rd time since this crisis. They have a phrase for that in case you read about it in the newspaper. Don't be mystified. It's called quantitative easing. This sounds like sort of how a large person settles into a couch. But it isn't. It's really about a better way to say printing money, because if you say, we're printing lots of money, people get frightened. But if you say quantitative easing, they have no idea what you're talking about. So this is preferable. And so we used to call it printing money, by the way. But now we call it quantitative easing. We have quantitative easing number 3 was announced. Why is that? Because we already had 2 of them. Both of them were announced as the solution to the problem, which we now know they weren't. We were promised, the promise wasn't delivered. Not with quantitative easing 1, not with quantitative easing 2. So by having quantitative easing 3, one thing is clear, that what was tried before failed to solve the problem. Let me say that again. That our leaders and our best minds working on this problem failed to solve the problem, so they're going to try to do it again and hope that the third try will get better results than the first two. Are they questioning the basic logic of what they're doing? Absolutely not. They're simply deciding they didn't spend enough new money, so they're going to try to do some more. Over the last 10 days, the European Central Bank, that's the equivalent for Europe of what the Federal Reserve is here, made the same decision. And they're pumping up the money in Europe. So all over the world, people are pumping up the money. And you know why? Because the crisis isn't being overcome. The recovery isn't happening. So the first thing that you all need to understand is that we are in a very bad economic crisis that at least over the next little while is going to get worse. And why is that important? Let's see. Since the Great Depression of the 1930s, every president of the United States has presided, some more, some less, over an economic downturn. You know, we had the great crisis of the 1930s. The economy crashed in 1929 and it didn't recover until 1941. 11 years of crisis. That was the worst we've had so far. The one we're in is the second worst, unless it lasts a lot longer, in which case it might make it to first place. Between the end of the Great Depression in 1941 and the beginning of this one in 2007, 11 economic downturns in the United States. A terribly unstable economic system, this capitalism that we Americans can't imagine criticizing. I like to tell people, so I'm going to say it again. I ask that you excuse me, those of you who've heard me do this before. If you lived with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. Or you would have demanded that that roommate get some professional help. But you live in an economic system whose instability is at least as devastating to you as a crazy roommate. But we don't even discuss it. We act like every time the yogurt we buy disappears from the fridge, it just did that by itself. Every time you come home late at night and there are more people in your roommate's bed than there one roommate and no one told you about it, you pretend nothing's going on. You just whistle and go into your room. Maybe. But after a certain while, that's not going to work. Not going to work. Well, capitalism is highly unstable. Every president, therefore, has presided over a downturn, and every president since Franklin Roosevelt, the one in power in the 1930s, has made the following interesting remark publicly to the people of America. If you follow my policies, each president has told us, including Mr. Obama, if you follow my policies, not only will we get out of this terrible economic crisis, but, pregnant pause, but, everybody's paying attention, follow my policies will make sure no such crisis ever again plagues our country. Every president promised that, and not a one of them has ever been able to deliver it. Have we been able to prevent these crises? Obviously not. We're in one. None of the presidents could do it because it's built into this system. It has resisted all of the efforts of all the well-trained economists. They couldn't control it. Listen, the worst thing that ever could have happened to George Bush and the Republicans happened in 2007 and 2008. They were running to hold on to the presidency in 2008. The last thing they wanted was an economic crisis. They did everything they could to make sure it didn't happen, and they couldn't do it. Mr. Obama didn't want to run for election at a time when the economy is in crappy shape and, as I just told you, going into the toilet further. That's not good for his re-election. He did everything he could to make sure that didn't happen, and he couldn't prevent it. Are these reasons to question an economic system that resists the efforts to make it work well, even for motives we might not admire? It ought to in a rational person, but it doesn't in our society. You will look long and hard in the speeches in the Congress or in either of the two conventions to find anyone who stands up and says, you know, folks, we Americans have got a problem with a dysfunctional economic system that we ought to be talking about. Oh, no. Oh, no. That's big pretense. And now that we have a crisis in which we're turning down, you'd think maybe it ought to be spoken about. But it isn't. Let me turn then to what's being done, this printing of money. A lot of you are interested in that, so let me talk to you about that. This is the question of whether throwing money at the economy is an effective way to make it work better. Well, let me explain to you what the idea behind it is, because it has its grain of truth. And the idea goes something like this. If we throw money at a lot of people, somehow, who didn't have it before, if we're lucky, they're going to take the money and run downtown and buy things with it. And if they do, and they buy a lot of stuff out of the stores with the extra money, why then the storekeeper is going to call the factory that makes the stuff and say, hey, send me more stuff because people are buying it off the shelf. And the factory will say, okay, we'll make more stuff, and they'll hire lots of people to make the extra stuff that can be sold to the people who have all this extra money. And by hiring all those workers, we'll start paying them salaries, so they will now be able to go buy some stuff, and that'll get, you see, it's wonderful. It's the idea of stimulating the economy by putting more money into the hands of people who will spend it. That's the idea. It's always been the idea. Not only that, it turns out that if you flood the economy with money, that people who have this money will also be interested in lending it to other people. And as more people want to lend money, they have to kind of lower the interest rate to get people to borrow all the extra money. So not only is there more money to spend, but interest rates go down. And that's good because it makes it cheaper to buy a car on time. Your payments are lower. It makes it cheaper to get a house because your mortgage is lower. So you know the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank stimulates the economy by printing more money and lowering the interest rates in the process. What a wonderful thing. Does it sometimes go like that? Yes, that has happened. There have been moments when an economy was kind of down and the monetary authorities threw some money at it and the interest rates went down and people began to spend the money and they began to lend more money and the economy perked up. Have there been times when it didn't work? Is there any way to know in advance whether it will? Probably not. It's a hit or miss arrangement. Here's what can go wrong. A, the government can give the money to the wrong people. Because here's what you want. You want the extra money to be spent on goods and services. That's what you want. Well, if you want to do that, you should give it to those most likely to go out and spend it. And who are those people? Answer, poor people. Because they don't have much. And if you give them an extra $5, they're probably going to spend it probably in a half an hour. You don't want to give it to rich people because they already have a lot and they're likely to stick it in their accounts at the bank or put it aside. They're not going to change their spending habits. They're already rich people. They buy what they want. An extra buck in their pocket isn't going to have that effect. So the logical way to be a stimulator with money would be a proposal I have made on occasion, and I'm going to make it now. The way to increase the money supply is to do the following. You print up a lot of new money. You put it in several large airplanes. No, this is serious. You fly the airplane, and you announce a different city each time. So on a certain day, you're announcing, New York, we will have a Federal Reserve System airplane. It'll fly over New York at 6:15 Thursday afternoon. So my advice to you all is get out in the street with a big shopping bag and run around like crazy to collect the dollars or the $10 or the $100 bills that we drop. Why would this be effective? Because it would fall into the hands of people who are very likely to spend it, which is what we want. We don't do that. The Federal Reserve gives the money mostly to banks. That's how they do it. Which isn't surprising because the Federal Reserve really is a part of the banking system. So they give it to banks. So now the question is any more spending. The banks don't spend it. What do the banks do? They lend it. Who do they lend it to? Well, they lend it to businesses, but the businesses, the economy is lousy. The businesses don't want to borrow. Even if you lower the interest rates are lower today in America than they've been in generations. But businesses are not borrowing because if the business is lousy, there's no point in borrowing money to produce more of what you can't sell anyway. So it's not working. So what are the banks doing with the extra money that they're getting since they can't find businesses to lend to? Well, you think they might lend it to the consumer. Nah, they're not going to do that anymore either because they just got badly burned by lending to lots of consumers who can't pay back. So they're not doing that anymore. They're being much more selective. The credit of the American consumer is shrinking each month because the banks are not going to make it easy for you. Not at all. Well, then what are the banks doing with the money? The answer is they're doing the one thing that they can do with the money at a time like this. You ready? They lend it to the government. Why? Because the government is running deficits. The government is spending a lot more money than it's taking in taxes. So the government has to borrow. Who does the government, the Treasury, borrow from? The very people that the Federal Reserve has given the money to. If this strikes you as lunacy, you got it. You live in this. That's how this is being done. The Federal Reserve is printing the money that goes to the government to allow the government to spend more than it raises in taxes. It allows a politician to say, I'm not raising your taxes. Meanwhile, oh my God, the government is building up the debt, which is funded by the printing of money. This is a crazy system. This is a crazy system. But we're not done yet. This is a crazy system that's also dangerous. Why is it dangerous? Because we have increased the total quantity of money in the United States by a huge magnitude over the last 5 years trying to cope with this crisis. The Federal Reserve and the Europeans were not the only ones increasing the quantity of money. It just sits in the hands of the banks. They lend it to the government. The banks also lend it to stock hustlers who play in the stock market, which is why prices of the stock market have been going up because there's all this money chasing the stocks. So it's good for people who have stocks because the prices of stocks have come back to where they were before the crisis, very nicely. But here's a danger. It might happen that all of that money that we've increased like crazy begins to think, the people who own it, that it may not be so smart to have so much money. It may be safer to buy things that will hold up their value more than the money will. There may come a time when the people with all this extra money, the companies, the bankers, the rich people, begin to want to convert that money into goods. If they ever do that, we will have an inflation. Money, the prices of things will go through the roof. That has happened in capitalism over and over again. In 1922, the most famous example, the German government was in an unspeakable difficult situation. Germany had lost World War I, and the countries that had won, mostly Britain and France and so on, imposed on the Germans a reparations obligation. The Germans would not only have lost the war, they would now have to pay the winners for the costs to the winners of fighting the war that the Germans lost. So Germany had to destroy itself economically in order to raise the money to give to the victorious countries. The Germans tried to do that, but it produced such a level of poverty and suffering among the German people that it became politically impossible. Something that is going on in a different way and for somewhat different reasons in places like Greece, Spain, and Portugal, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes now. But we're back in 1922. So what did the German government do to get out of this impossible situation? They began to print money. And in a one-year period from the middle of 1922 to 1923, the prices in Germany went crazy. I mean, really crazy. So for example, from a quarter pound of butter costing in a store in Berlin 4 marks. Marks is the name of the currency in Germany at that time. Deutsche Marks. A year later, a quarter pound of butter cost you 6 billion, with a B, marks. That's an inflation. Prices were doubling every 3 hours. You had to change the price in the store, that was the little sticker on the milk carton, every 3 hours because the price went up. Workers who got paid twice a day. And the worker would arrange for his wife or her husband to come and get the paycheck, run to the store, because if you waited till the afternoon, your pay wouldn't be worth anything, wouldn't buy you anything, because the prices had gone up. You think that can only happen in Germany? Is it only a country that it happened? It's happened in loads of countries. Is there a danger that all this extra money could begin to try to be spent and drive up the prices in the United States? You bet. And what's our protection? The Federal Reserve, led by Mr. Bernanke, has repeatedly said, we have the tools and we have the knowledge to take money out of the economy in the event that an inflation should emerge. This is the same Fed that didn't take any steps to prevent this crisis, couldn't figure out why it happened, couldn't overcome it in the last 5 years. But we're supposed to believe that everything is in place to make sure we don't have an inflation from all of these increases in the money supply. And if you believe that, I would like to offer you a special deal. I will sell you the Brooklyn Bridge. Be careful. We are in very treacherous economic waters, uncharted in terms of the problems, and without a clue as to what to do, hoping like crazy that the various things we do will somehow all work out. And there is no reason that I can find as an economist to believe that. Third item for tonight. Over the last week, Mr. Romney got himself into a pickle. And because it had to do with economic analysis, I want to talk about it a little bit. It's not that I want to pick on Mr. Romney in favor of Mr. Obama or vice versa. That's not my intent. I admit that I enjoy it, but it's not what I'm after here. And by the way, I enjoy doing that to Mr. Obama as well. I really do. But tonight, it's Mr. Romney's chance. Mr. Romney was taped. He wasn't aware of it, apparently. He was taped by someone who participated in a fundraising evening in Florida. I think it was a few weeks or a couple of months ago or something. And he was speaking to these wealthy people that were giving money, and he was talking to them. And he basically said, I'm sure many of you have read it, you just look at the newspapers the last few days, they're all full of this. He basically said that about half the American people he can't reach as a candidate, and they're lost to him. And these are the people who don't pay taxes, he said, and who instead live off the government. They feel that they are victims in some way, so that they're entitled to government support. So you get the impression, he didn't use this word, but you get the impression that sort of half of America are a bunch of moochers. They don't do much, they don't take care of themselves, and they depend on government handouts, and they vote for the Democrats to make sure the handouts keep coming. Some version like that. It looked for a while that Mr. Romney put his foot in it and would have to make an apology, but his handlers apparently decided he wouldn't do that. He would say that he stood by his term. I think he said he didn't word it elegantly, but basically this was what he said. And I think we should take it seriously because, in fact, an awful lot of people in America believe that. Mr. Romney is in no way unique or alone, and particularly wealthy people. Since I went to Harvard, Stanford, and Yale, those were my fellow students, with a few exceptions, like me, who slipped in there for reasons nobody can understand. Those folks, a lot of them, think like that. So let's talk about that. First of all, the income tax in the United States. Let's be sure we all understand it. It's clear to me that Mr. Romney doesn't understand how the tax system works. Or if he does, then he's a liar. I mean, but I'm assuming he's a very honest, straightforward guy, and so he's not going to lie to us. But so I have to assume he just doesn't know. So maybe if he's watching tonight, he can learn too. Okay, because this is what we teach to our students, because it's part of our job as economics teachers to teach you about the tax system. Okay, we have an income tax system in the United States that taxes two kinds of income by the federal government in Washington. We have a separate tax system at the state level and a third tax system at the local level. So So many countries don't do this. Many countries put all the taxes in one, so you're not having 3 different governments taxing the same person. We don't do that in America. We have a federal tax, a state tax, and a local tax, and they're completely different. So if you're going to talk about taxes, you unfortunately have to talk about all of them. Otherwise, you're going to create a misunderstanding by talking about one of them as if it encompassed the whole story. That's the first mistake of Mr. Romney. The income tax at the federal level is only a small part of our tax system. It's not the whole story. So whatever's true about it isn't the whole story. And to represent that it might be is, I'll be polite, misleading. Or it suggests you don't know what you're talking about. What is the federal income tax? It is a tax on the income of individuals and a tax on the income of businesses. Both entities' income is taxed. Okay? So, first, let's understand that the income tax is on business and on individuals. So we haven't talked about everything if we just talk about individuals. But Mr. Romney was only dealing with individuals. So let's talk about individuals. How does that work? Well, the federal government does rely in a significant way on the individual income tax. It brings the government roughly 40 to 45, depending on how you count, % of its money. It's not even the bulk of it. It's not even the majority of it. It's just a little less than half, more or less. That's what the federal income tax gets. Less than half of what the government takes in. It is a progressive tax. Really important, you all understand what that means. Everybody pays the same percentage on the first 10,000. Everybody pays the same, a higher percentage on the next 10,000, and so on. Okay? Till you get to the top. The highest rate, the top rate, is 35%. So that's the most you're going to pay on the amount of money that you earn. Okay? So it's progressive because the more you earn, the higher the percentage of your income you pay. Every other tax in the United States, with a very few exceptions, doesn't work like that. Only the income tax is progressive. Only the income tax taxes you more the richer you are. Okay? Second, a moment of history. History is really important. The individual income tax, the highest bracket, the highest level now is 35%. Was it always 35%? No. After World War II, the United States was in a tough position, like we are now. We had been through the Great Depression of the 1930s, followed by World War II, which was a difficult experience for this country. So we had to rebuild in the later 1940s into the 50s and 60s. We had to rebuild the American economy from the twin traumas of a Great Depression and World War II. And it was decided that the government had to take the lead. Everybody agreed on that, almost everybody. The government had to take the lead and rebuild the American economy, which the government did. For example, we had never done this before as a nation, the GI Bill, famous law, which said to every returning soldier in America who had been involved in fighting World War II, if he, and there were a few she's, not many then, not like now, but there were some, but if he or she, returning soldier, wanted to go to college, the United States government, and I want to say this particularly for those of you from Ramapo, the United States government would pay the entire cost of a 4-year college education, which the government did for millions of American returning soldiers. And that was thought an appropriate action of the government to honor the soldiers who had, some of them came home wounded and all the other things, and they had risked their lives, etc., etc., etc. But it was also clearly understood by the people who passed that law that we didn't have jobs for these soldiers. When we demobilized the army at the end of World War II, the great fear was we're going to go back into the depression we had before the war. Where are the jobs? All those people who'd taken off their uniforms, we don't have jobs for them. So let's send them to school. That way they won't be unemployed, they'll be doing something useful. So the government paid for that. You might wonder, particularly those of you that are young, we have the same problem now. We don't have jobs for young people. What we're doing is wasting their lives. What we ought to be doing is taking advantage and having the government say to those people, we're going to do for you now pretty much what we did back in 1945. We're going to pass another GI Bill, and we're going to make it possible for millions of Americans to get an education, to make valuable use of the time when there isn't a job, and not saddle them with unbearable debts. Not only do we not do that in the United States, you're all building up debt like there's no tomorrow. While you gear up your debt, you get your graduation degree and discover you're never going to be able to pay it back. Not with the incomes you're going to get from the jobs you're likely to get. But again, in America, do you all know about this? Do we discuss the virtues of maybe another GI Bill for schooling, but not for GIs this time, just for our young people? Doesn't even come up. Romney doesn't say a word about it. Obama doesn't say a word about it. It's like it never happened, but it did. And I just told you about it. And we did a lot of other things. And the government took the lead. And the government was active in solving these problems. And it had to pay for that, of course. Gee, it's expensive to send all those ex-soldiers to school. How did the government pay for such things? It had a very high income tax rate. What was the income tax, the highest bracket for the richest people? What was the bracket? It's 35% now. What was it in the 1950s and 60s?
91?
That's right. 91%. 91%. One more time. 91%. Wealthy people over the last 50 years have seen what they have to pay to help this society recover in its economic downturn, dropping from 91% to 35%. You want to know why our government's in debt? You got it. There it is, staring you right in the face. This is not about a government that didn't spend wisely. The government often doesn't spend wisely, but that's true of everybody. Think about your grandmother. Think about yourself. You always spend everything you spend wisely? Stop. Stop it. Can a critic of yours find a case where you spent unwisely? How hard would it be? So does the government sometimes screw that up? Of course it does. But that's not why we're in trouble. We're in trouble because the richest people in the country have been able to drop their tax rate from 91% to 35%. Okay? So we have what? We have an income tax that raises half the money that the government needs, partly because we lowered it on the rich people. And it does that in a progressive way, but the progressivity is very limited. It only goes to 35%, where once upon a time it went to 91. So what is Romney saying? He's saying, well, half the people don't pay any income tax. That's true. Half the people don't pay that personal income tax. Why? Very simple. Laws that were passed, by the way, with Republicans voting for them most of the time. So the idea that we Republicans, that's not true. Why are there half the people who don't pay income taxes? Well, let's see. First of all, the income tax doesn't start at zero. The first few $1,000s you get, it's thought to make you so poor. If you earn, let's say, $6,500 a year, you are so poor the income tax doesn't apply to you. And the argument there is, if you earn that little money, you're barely getting by as it is. The government shouldn't take more money out of your pocket because you're in danger of being unable to reproduce yourself with enough food and clothing and shelter. So it's an idea that you don't tax people who are on the edge of disaster. That's one exemption. But that's not the only one. We also passed laws in this country that say if you earn some money, not $6,000, but not a lot, and you have children, you get exempted because of your children. Because the society wants you, even if your income is low, to be able to take care of your children. Otherwise, your children would be suffering through no fault of their own because of your income situation, whatever the cause of that is. So we give them an exemption. We say you don't have to pay. Then we have other exemptions. If your income is relatively low, for example, if you're an older person who's retired and you're living on Social Security, and for those of you who don't know, that's not easy because Social Security doesn't give you very much. But if you're an older person, you live on Social Security, the United States Congress, Republicans too, voted to exempt that money that you get as an old person, your retirement money, from the income tax, so you don't pay. Wow. So a lot of the people he talked about are children and old people. Children and old people. A lot of the people who don't pay income tax are children and old people. So what Mr. Romney was saying is, we really got to stick it to the children and the old people. But if he said that, of course, we would all go, ah, right? You can't say that. So he rewrites the story. These are moochers. They're the people who depend on it. What are you talking about? That's who those people are. Are there people, by the way, who game the system? Who play, who cheat, and who pretend they're poorer than they? Of course there are. Everybody games the system, starting with Mr. Romney. Well, he admitted it. He didn't even deny it. He said a few months ago, when he released the 1 or 2 years' worth of income tax that he actually released, remember all that hoopla about that? He released it and he said, I paid 13% of my income in income taxes. Let's do that again. 13%. The man earns millions of dollars a year. He should be paying, top rate, 35%. But he uses the Bahamas or the Cayman Islands, and he has this legal, but he games the system too, in his way, to get it down. So there's nothing about poor people that makes them unique in gaming the system. Do they, some of them do it? You got it. And do really rich people like Mr. Romney do it? You got it. There are lots of very wealthy people, I know them personally, who pay no income taxes. They know how to play the gambit, and they get out of it altogether. Then there are the super rich who pay no taxes. He forgot to mention those. Here's how you do that, for those of you that are interested, and I can see some of you are paying more attention right now as we go into this. If you have $1 million, and you use them, this is American law, and you use them to buy something called municipal bonds. That is, you use your $1 million and you lend it to states and cities around the United States, who are always raising money with bond issues. You know, like New York City has to build a sewer someplace, and they have a bond issue. They raise the money to build the sewer. They issue a bond, which is an obligation of the city of New York, or for that matter, the state of New York, to repay the lender over a period of years, so much interest, and then the principal is repaid at the end. It's a regular bond. Under American law, the income you earn from a municipal bond is free of all taxation. So if you're a resident of New York City, for example, and you lend $1 million to the city of New York to build a sewer or to build the East Side subway line that they've been working on since time immemorial, and so on, here's what happens. The interest you get, whatever that is, tens of thousands of dollars a year on the $1 million investment you made in that bond, you pay no tax to the federal government on that interest income, you pay no tax to the state of New York, and you pay no tax to the city of New York. You could earn $50,000 of interest, and your taxes on that would be zero. Are there rich people who do that? Loads of them. They're all over the place. There are special departments in the brokerage houses to deal with those people. So some of the people who pay no taxes are rich people who use and there are many other laws like this that allow you to do that. That's using, by the way, some of those laws is how Romney got his tax bill down to 13%. Some of you know that a year ago, Warren Buffett, who's much richer than Mr. Romney, Warren Buffett, you know Warren Buffett, the head of Berkshire Hathaway, one of the 10 richest people in the United States, became famous because he said he did a survey. He's got 17 people, he said, in his office. And he compared the percentage of his income that he paid in taxes, he's a billionaire many times over, to what the other 17, the secretaries and office workers. And he was aghast to discover that every one of the secretaries and office workers in his office, 17 people, all paid a higher percentage of their income in taxes than he did. And he concluded that the United States was in a very bad place if that kind of thing was allowed to happen. Okay? All of this was finessed by Mr. Romney. Now let's take a look at the people who don't pay an income tax. Is it reasonable to say that they don't pay taxes? No. Because the other big tax that sustains the federal government is called a payroll tax. You actually, most of you know about that. That's the money that is withheld on the checks you get every week, which say things like Social Security or FICA or something like that. That's the money held back for your Social Security when you get old. That's taken out. That's money that the government takes from us. That isn't progressive. The same percentage is applied to everybody. And in fact, it only goes up to $107,000, where a certain percentage is taken out. They don't take any more. If you earn more than $107,000, they don't continue to take it out. For every dollar over $107,000, nothing is taken out. So if you're rich and you get millions, most of that money has no money taken out of it for Social Security, just the first $107,000. So it isn't progressive, it's the opposite. It's called regressive. The richer you are, the smaller the percentage of your money taken for Social Security. But we're not done. Then there are state taxes. The state of New York, for example, relies very heavily on a sales tax. You know, every time you buy a piece of underwear, you know that whatever the price is of the underwear, you got to give a little extra at the end. It goes up automatically on the cash register. That's your sales tax. Is that progressive? No. When you buy underpants, you've got to pay exactly as much as Rockefeller if he buys, believe it or not, the same underpants you just bought. Rockefeller and you pay the same amount of tax on that, no effort to be progressive. And what about the local level of taxes? Not the federal, not the state. The local level of taxes is a property tax. Most cities and towns depend on taxing property. They don't tax income, and they don't tax what you spend. They tax what you own. And that is the most regressive system of all. Because here I'm going to tell you something in case I haven't got this across in the past. Do we have a property tax? Yes. Does it tax all property? No. Here's what cities and towns tax: land, homes, cars, and business inventories. So if you live in any town, as opposed to living up in the air, if you live in a town somewhere, you're either paying, if you own your land or you own your house, you're paying the property tax. If you don't, if you rent, you can be damn sure that part of the reason your rent is what it is that the person who owns the house to whom you pay rent has to pay tax, and he's recouping that rent the tax he has to pay by charging you more rent. So you pay it directly or indirectly. But here's the best part about property tax in America. We tax land, houses, cars, business inventories. Do we tax your property in stocks and bonds? No. Let me do that again. We don't tax the value of your property in stocks and bonds. If you have a $100,000 house anywhere in America, you pay a property tax. If you sell that house and you use the money to buy $100 worth of stock, do you pay a property tax on the $100,000 worth of stock? Not a nickel. 1% of Americans own 75% of the stock. That is the most regressive tax imaginable. It exempts the rich from paying a tax on the property that the rich are the monopoly owners of. At this point, if we had more time and I wasn't pressed, I would stop talking and just play you the national anthem. You understood. You understood. So what is Mr. Romney doing? He's forgetting that every family pays property tax directly or through their rent. That every family, rich, poor, and alike, pay those sales taxes that we all have to pay. And here in New York City, for example, we have not just the state sales tax, we also have on top of it the city sales tax. We get to pay too. And the poor people have to pay the same tax on a bag of potato chips that a rich person does. There's no progressivity there. Guess what? When you put it all together, the American tax system isn't progressive. Poor people pay the same or roughly the same percentage of their income in taxes as do rich people. Mr. Romney either doesn't know or, and I won't go there. Last point. I have up here a little chart for you, and let me explain what it means. This chart says we need to remember that people pay taxes or not, not according to whether they're rich or poor, but mostly according to where they are in their lifetime. When you're a child, these are the ages, 20 years old on up. And these are the percentage of people that pay a tax. Notice the income tax, which is the lower line. For people that are below 20, they don't pay any income tax. They're children. They're not relevant. They don't get any income to themselves, and so they don't pay a tax. But when they get to be a certain age, then they're suddenly required to pay taxes, like most people. And then when they get older, at Social Security, it drops down again. So the question really isn't who pays and who doesn't, because what you're not seeing is that the people who aren't paying are children and old people. Because that's the way our system is set up. They did pay between the ages of 20 and 65, because all of us do. Had Romney even a clue about how taxes work, he would have understood that one of the reasons we have a high percentage of people not paying now is that we have a disproportionate number of our people older. That's the way our population is. People are becoming older, and the more that are older, the more are in the Social Security situation where they are not taxed. Mr. Romney is either ignorant, poorly informed, or and I won't go there. Okay? And it was sad to see how few people took him up on that question. The last part of Mr. Romney's story. Why is he saying that? You know, this isn't about statistics and understanding the rigors of taxation. I've tried to give you an overview so you could see that what he was talking about, he's at best mistaken. But that's not what this is about. Let me try to explain to you in economic terms what this is going on. Mr. Romney has a problem, and it's the problem of rich people. But he's serious. He's a very rich person, so he has this problem in Spain. He's one of the 1%, right? If anybody is, he is. Mr. Obama, by the way, is also in that group, the 1% by his income. So it's not, he's not as rich as Mr. Romney, but he's in the club. These rich people have a problem. The economic system of capitalism has worked for them really well. They are 1%. They have oodles of money. Look at how problematic this has been for Mr. Romney. His wife made that mistake about discussing her 2 Cadillacs. Remember? You know, he made a number of mistakes because he's used to that and didn't remember how that might sound. Kind of feel for the guy. You know, he's used to being at the country club with a gin, and there you can say things which don't fly so well when you're talking to people who don't go to country clubs and who think gin is a game. Okay? So in any case, Mr. Romney has a problem, and all those rich people do. The economic system, capitalism, has been very good for them, and really not so good for an awful lot of other people. And there's a natural problem in a society when that happens. The people who are not doing well, especially if they can constantly see what the people who are doing well are doing with all their money, with their Cadillacs and their 6 homes and all the rest, when that's part of the culture, when you see all that, it's like in a medieval society, if you're a very poor peasant, and every 2 days the prince has to come through on his, you know, it pisses you off. Somewhere it upsets you. And people who get upset then look around, what can I do? Well, we have a peculiar political system, don't we? We have this 1 person, 1 vote stuff, which leads the people who are screwed in the economy to begin to say, you know something? I'm getting nowhere in this economy. I'm never going to be rich like these people. I'm barely holding on to my job. My job is giving me fewer benefits than it used to. It's more precarious than it ever was. I'm never going to be Mr. Romney or anything like that. I'm angry about it. I work real hard. I want the best for my kids. I want the American dream, all that. And those people are going to say, you know something? Maybe we could use the political system to undo the effects of the economic system. Maybe we can use our 1 person, 1 vote to say to the average American, hey, we who are screwed in the economic system, we're the majority. We could make the decisions politically, and we could make the political system offset or undo the inequality that comes out of the economic system. Now, it may take a while for poor people to get this idea, but let me assure you, rich people, They figured this out long ago. They understood the risk to their dominant position economically coming from the political system. And so they went to work to make sure that the political system couldn't and wouldn't be used to undo the results of the economic system, because that scared them. How do you do that in a system where one person has a vote? Everybody gets a vote, more or less. That's a problem. How do you do it? You've got to somehow persuade a significant number of people who are getting screwed to not do that, to somehow support you, the 1%, in your dominance. That's not easy. How do you do it? And the answer found in each country is a little bit different depending on its culture and its history. In the United States, the answer was the one found by what Mr. Romney said. Here's how it works. You appeal to as many of the people in the vast middle who are having a hard time. And you say to them, you're not having a hard time because of an economic system that screws you at every turn, that only gives the bigger rewards to those at the top. No, 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 no. You know why you're having a hard time? It's because you're paying the taxes that sustain all those moochers. And you should support us, Republicans, who are not going to allow you to be taxed for those lazy, victim-thinking, unindependent, not self-affirming losers. Wow. I could be better off. I could have lower taxes if we just didn't sustain those bums. Those bums. That's been the policy of this in the country of the rich in this society from the beginning. They have to come up with those kinds of arguments because they have to win over a significant number of the average people who are in fact being screwed in this economic system. They have to make sure we never question the system, and they have to come up with some logic that would make a worker and his wife, or a worker and her husband, who are not making the kind of living that allow them to enjoy the American dream or give it to their kids, not to get angry at a system that doesn't reward them in a reasonable way to do what it says they ought to want. No, no, no. Get angry at poorer people than you. Be angry that they are the ones sucking the taxes out of you so that they can live the life of Riley doing nothing. Make enough people angry at other workers that they go with you, and never use politics to undo what the economic system has done to them. The major exception to that in American history was the Great Depression. And so I have something to say about that that ties over. Many of you who watched the Republican National Convention, how many of you looked at that? People, okay, some, all right. You noticed, I hope, and I think some commentators also noticed it, that there was a glaring absence. George Bush. He was the last Republican president. It wasn't all that long ago. He was the leader of the party. What happened? He hadn't died. As far as we knew, there was none of those pomp and circumstance when presidents die. So we knew he wasn't dead. And every now and then his face would be in the news. What happened? And people said, my goodness, they must have been, what? Well, it's not too hard to figure out. What does Mr. Bush represent? He represents the last Republican in office, whose last year, year and a half, was a year of the worst economic crisis in current people's lifetime. That's not the kind of association you want to bring up in people's minds. It's not good for getting votes, so they kept him away. But there was another reason. Bush, in his last year and a half, took a number of steps to try to cope with that crisis. He had a stimulus plan. He did. He gave us money back on our income tax. Some of you may remember that. He did a variety, and he bailed out banks left and right. He did the same thing Obama did. So if you brought him back, what would Mr. Romney be able to say? He couldn't criticize then Mr. Obama for what he did, because Mr. Bush had done the same. Obama just did more of it. But But he didn't change the Bush policy. He even kept the same Bush officials in office, Mr. Obama. So for Romney to bring Bush back would have been bad two ways. So Bush vanished. We used to make fun in the Soviet Union that they would have officials whom they didn't like who then disappeared from the books. But we don't have to go to Russia to see such things. We just watched one this summer. We watched the past president, the leader, the most important Republican in the last, didn't exist. He was, I don't know, playing golf in Texas or whatever it is he does, but he was not, his face was not there. But there was a similar absence at the Democratic Convention, and nobody said a word about this. Who was absent? Another president who has a name. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt, a Democrat, was the president the last time our economy collapsed like this, the Great Depression. If you paid close attention, Mr. Obama, early in his speech, made a reference to Franklin Roosevelt. And here's what he said. He said he had tried some innovative, bold experiments. What? What was he, in a lab with a Bunsen burner? What is this? He made bold experiments. No, he didn't. He did things in the 1930s. And the reason Franklin Roosevelt wasn't mentioned was because A, the things he did worked, and B, the things he did, no Democratic official from Obama down has dared to talk about. That's why he had to vanish, just like Mr. Bush. Let me remind you, what did Roosevelt do? A, he invented, created the Social Security system. We never had one before. In the midst of the terrible Depression, he said to all the people 65 years of age and older in America, you've given a lifetime of work to the United States, so the government is now in the middle of a depression. When everybody said, there's no money, he said, we've got the money, we're going to give you a check every month for the rest of your life. Whoa. And no sooner was he done, he went on the radio again and he said, I got another great idea. We've never had in this country an unemployment compensation program. If you lose your work through no fault of your own, say because the company can't sell the output, so they tell you we can't keep you working because there's no point in paying you a wage to produce stuff we can't sell, so you're fired, don't come back Monday morning. If that happens to you, said Mr. Roosevelt, you will now be eligible for a year or two for an unemployment check every week. Yay! Whoa! There were millions of people unemployed in 1933 when he did that. And then the best one, the third program of Roosevelt. By the way, these were not experiments. This is what he did. Mr. Obama, he didn't experiment. He did these things. Third one, he created a federal jobs program. He went on the radio and he said, if the private sector of this country cannot provide work to the millions of Americans who need and want it, then there is no alternative but for me as the president to do it. And between 1934 and 1941, the federal government created and filled somewhere between 12.5 and 20 million jobs. There's a debate what the number is, but it doesn't matter. He gave jobs and incomes to people. Has Mr. Obama increased the Social Security benefits in this country? Not at all. Reverse. Has Mr. Obama even discussed a federal jobs program? Not one word. That's why Roosevelt had to be out. That's why we can refer to him to being bold experiments. Wow. He had to be kept away, because if you brought Mr. Roosevelt in, you would have brought in all the things he did, and the obvious question would be, how come that's not happening now? Why aren't we doing that? What were the results in the 30s? What did they learn? What can we learn from that? If it wasn't a perfect program, is there a variation on it we could do now? All the logical questions that reasonable people would have. That was too dangerous because it would imply a criticism of the Democrats. So Mr. Obama banished Mr. Roosevelt every bit as thoroughly as Mr. Romney banished Mr. Bush. Running out of time. Two more things. Stay with me. An obscure decision a month ago. So obscure that I really doubt anyone in the room heard it, but if any of you did, talk to me afterwards. This was a decision reached by the Supreme Court of the state of Washington, way over on the West Coast. And the state of Washington Supreme Court declared that terrible mistakes bordering on fraud were committed by the following company: Mortgage Electronic Registration Systems. You'll be excused if you never heard of this. It is usually known by an acronym, MERS, the initials of those 4 words, MERS. And you will also be excused if that means nothing to you either. Let me tell you what MERS is, or was. It is, still exists. MERS was a company created by the banks in the United States to speed up the mortgage process starting in the middle of the 1990s, when the housing industry in America really got going and the banks had figured out how to give mortgages to millions of Americans that they had never allowed to get mortgages before, because they were making unbelievable money out of it. They had to have a system to speed up the whole process. They created a business, this MERS, whose job it was to process. And part of this involved when a bank, any bank, made a mortgage with you, and you signed all the papers, so you now owed the money that you used to buy a house. You had to pay the bank back. That's called a mortgage agreement. And this MERS would take that mortgage, and if necessary, the bank that gave it to you would sell it to somebody else who sold it. It became a negotiable instrument, it's called. A document that could pass from hand to hand as different people owned it. And you might have thought your mortgage was held by the bank that wrote it with you because you sent your checks there every month. But in fact, that mortgage had probably traded through 50 hands. So this then became a problem when people began to default in 2006 and 7. The people who had been given mortgages who couldn't afford them, or had been misled about the mortgage, believing that the low interest they were paying at the beginning would always be that, not understanding that after 2 years or 4 years it would jump up, and all of those things we now know about. It was MERS that handled all of that, handled the movement of the mortgage from one to another, from one investor to another. So when the defaults came, people stopped paying their debt. Whoever owned it said, hey, I'm not getting my money. And they went after the people who couldn't pay their mortgages. And for those of you that are not familiar with this, in the United States, if you don't pay your mortgage for a certain number of months, the person who owns that obligation of yours can have you thrown out of the house. They go through a legal procedure called a foreclosure. They go through the courts, and after a certain amount of time, the court informs you, since you haven't paid your monthly mortgages for 2 months or 6 months or whatever it is, you must vacate the house. You lose the house. You must be out of the house by Thursday at noon. And then for those of you who don't know, Thursday at noon, the sheriff, that's the official. It's one of the few things sheriffs do. They used to go and kill Indians, but we don't need this anymore. And so now we have them come and foreclose your house, one of the things they do. And they come with their deputies, and they take, if you're not out, they take your stuff, you know, your couch and your TV and whatever, your shoes, and they put them out on the curb. And then if you don't remove them from the curb, the Public Works Department comes along and with a garbage truck, and that's it. You're done. Well, these foreclosures turned out to have to identify who was the owner of the mortgage on your house if you were the person not paying. And they didn't know. And they took lots of shortcuts because they had done this all real hothouse fashion in the 1990s. And the Supreme Court of Washington declared that the banks did this in a sloppy, self-serving, probably fraudulent way. And here comes the punchline. Anyone who was foreclosed out of their home, those are millions of Americans that have lost their homes over the last few years, might very well be entitled to get their house back because fraud was involved in the processing of their loans before and during the foreclosure process. And now other attorney generals of other states have joined in the process and are filing the same claims. This is going to be a whole nother problem for America's banks. It's going to clog the court system in the United States as millions of people learn to go to a lawyer and begin to take the steps to undo the loss of their house. It'll mean people who then bought the house after it was foreclosed are now going to be informed that they don't have the house they bought. Whoa! Why am I telling you this? Here's the reason. I want to go down a short list with you of what has been proven about the private banks of the United States over the last year and a half? I just want you to have it all in your head. Well, you've just heard they really screwed up here on the mortgage process. They did something which at least one Supreme Court in the United States has found to be, if not fraudulent, close enough to be undone. All consumers, according to this decision, now have the standing to go to court to reopen their foreclosure case. Okay, second thing. Many banks have now admitted by paying huge fines to the United States government that they were engaged in money laundering. That's been publicly acknowledged. Money laundering means, it's a technical term, it means that a criminal, an illegal source of money has been processed in a bank, so it goes through several accounts, so it can then be used as somebody's account, and you can't kind of trail and trace it back to the illegal source, typically drugs, business that it comes from. And banks are legally supposed to not do that. They're supposed to report any large transactions. They're supposed to report anything of a suspicious origin. They really are. So they've been caught doing money laundering. So now we have this fraudulent mortgage process and money laundering. Are we done? Not even close. During the summer, there was the LIBOR scandal. Let me make sure you all know about that. London Interbank Offered Rate. This is an interest rate that is gotten by a survey, by the Bank of England, a survey of a dozen or 2 dozen large banks around the world. What are they charging for interest? And that, they take an average of that, and that's what everybody in the world uses as the basic interest rate. That's what the car company uses when they decide what your monthly payments will be for your car. That's what a bank uses to calculate how much they'll charge you for a mortgage rate. So this interest rate affects everybody's life. It turned out a scandal that the banks had fraudulently, knowingly misreported what they were actually charging to shape that interest rate either higher or lower because they would make a lot of money if it were a little higher. They didn't give an honest reading. Barclays Bank, one of the biggest banks in the world, paid a fine of, I believe, $450 million to the British government as its acknowledgement of having done, and others are being investigated now. So everybody's interest rate, and since every business we have, that every store you go into has to do borrowing, the price you pay for your socks and for your hamburger and for your haircut are shaped in part by the interest rates that were being fraudulently manipulated. So, messed up the mortgage business, laundered money, phonied the interest rates. Are we done? No, no. Several banks, including Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and others, admitted this summer by paying huge fines, again, tens, hundreds of millions of dollars, for having applied inappropriate, illegal fees to people for all kinds of secondary bank services. You know, if you bounce a check or if your balance falls below a certain amount, you can be hit with various kinds of fees. They were doing that. They were pushing on people services. For example, prevent identity theft. Give us $50 a month, and we will, all of which was turned out to be phony. So they were caught doing that, and they paid fines. And finally, we now know that in the crash of 2007, much of what was going on were the banks showing a fundamental failure. To understand this, I have to remind you what a bank is. A bank in economics is called a financial intermediary. The basic idea is people put money into a bank. Individuals like deposits in your checking and savings account, a company in its commercial account, and then the bank is supposed to be the custodian, if you like, of your money. You count on the fact that you can get your deposits back. It's your money, after all. And the job of the bank is to hold that money, keep it safe, and if they lend it out, which of course they want to do because that's how they make their money, by lending out what you put in there, they're supposed to be super careful. They're supposed to be close, careful guardians and never take a risk with what is, after all, other people's money. And that's their job. And even if they go out and get investors to make an investment in the bank, they're supposed to be very prudent determiners of who is a risky borrower and not lend to him, and who is a secure borrower and lend only to him. So if in the year 2007 and 8, millions of Americans proved to be unable to repay their loans, then one thing is crystal clear. The judgment of the private banks as to who was and was not a risky borrower stank. That's a technical term. Stank. They blew it. Remember, if a person can't pay back, that's the problem of the person who can't pay back, but it's also the problem of whoever lent to him, because you were supposed to determine before you made a loan whether a person could pay it. That's your job. That's what we have banks for. Okay, so let's review. They lent and took risks way beyond anything anyone could justify. They launder money. They charge fees that are illegal. They set up a phony or inadequate mortgage system, and they manipulated the LIBOR rate. Come on. If any public institution in this country had a record of such incompetent, illegal, damaging results, the scream across America would be, privatize. Take it away from these incompetent bureaucrats, because they have blown it. They've screwed up big time. There's 7 I listed to you here. 7 things they didn't do real well. Not a word. Not a word. The obvious thing a reasonable population would do is say, wait a minute, why do we have private banks if they work like this? Why don't we have the government take this over? It couldn't do a worse job, even if it set out to. We're not allowed to ask the question. We can't think it. It's a part of America. We can't. Oh no, we mustn't. Let's have a regulation. What? Let's add a clause to the Dodd-Frank bill that says to these banks, be nice. Be nice. Good. Don't do it. It's bad, and you shouldn't, and you'll have a harder time in church on Sunday if you do. And we all know what kind of behavior change that gets you. We have a private banking system which long ago lost the right to continue by virtue not of a philosophy or an ideology, but by virtue of a performance as abysmal. Billions and billions of dollars have been paid in various kinds of fines by America's banks for this. But they're so big and they're so profitable that, in the words of one leading American banker, what's the problem with these fines? For us, they're just bumps along the road. Well, if you needed any further evidence that we've got a system that doesn't work, that's what I think it would be. All right, folks, I have taken your time for more than the hour and a half I am allotted. Let me really invite you to think about, thank you. Let me invite you not only to come on the 9th of October, where we're going to look not so much at what's going wrong, but what that solution for this really looks like, and why I think it is a solution, and why those examples that exist in the United States and elsewhere now point in that direction, and invite you to be there for a book signing party that's part of that evening. But I also want to remind you what the point and purpose of these evenings is. I take it as my job to come here and to give you another way of looking at what's happening. It's really not about this or that particular topic, although I'm more than happy to have you suggest topics to me. It's more that you begin to think about things in a different way, that you view this as an economic system, this capitalism, that is in very, very deep trouble. Here in Europe, the economies that have held us up for the last few years, China, India, Russia, Brazil, they're all going down now too, so that the downturn I told you about at the beginning is now a global downturn. Nothing is going to boost us up because everybody is depending on everybody else to do the boosting, and it isn't there. I couldn't do everything I set out to do tonight. There were topics like Europe, Greece, Portugal, and so on that I wanted to talk about. Ireland. I will get to those in the months that come, I do promise. But remember, the point is to have a chance for your mind, each of you, to look at these kinds of things, both what we've gone over and what you will read in the newspaper and see on TV, with a different mindset. I hope that you ask hard questions about what's going on. Don't listen to the people, whether they be the TV announcer or the newspaper article or the politician, who basically wish to get across to you the idea that it's under control, that it's doing all right, that we're muddling through, it's going to get... I know we all want to believe it. It isn't true. This is a system with fundamental problems that have not been addressed in half a century of cheerleading when there should have been serious debate and criticism. And we're now paying the price. The very least we can do is in meetings like this not to continue the process. I spent the last 2 weeks in California. I spoke in Palo Alto, Berkeley, and San Francisco. Bigger audiences than I have ever had before, in the hundreds and hundreds of people, on radio, on television. And once again, I want you to know this only because this critical perspective that I'm trying to articulate here is now acceptable across the United States in ways that haven't been true for half a century. I began my speaking in California at the First Baptist Church of Palo Alto, California. As somebody here explained to me, took her a half an hour to digest the very fact and thought of me with these ideas, sharing them with fellow Baptists. I'm not myself a Baptist, but I did the best impression I knew how of Baptists at that meeting, and it was fine. They were fine with what we did. If you're interested, the speech I gave in that church is now being carried on something called Link TV. Some of you know what that is. A next talk I gave was in a wonderful place, the City Lights bookstore of San Francisco. Some of you may know what that is. That's where Allen Ginsberg and Lawrence Ferlinghetti, a very famous place in the middle of downtown San Francisco. And that, which we hadn't been told before, the talk I gave there, which was harder in my critique of capitalism than what I did tonight. We were surprised C-SPAN came, and you will be able to see that on there. They have a book program on C-SPAN where they have, and that'll be me speaking there. I don't even solicit these things. They come to me. So for those of, what?
You were on Charlie Rose.
I was on Charlie, that's right, over the summer, but since last we met, Charlie Rose brought me and David Harvey, another Marxist professor, and brought us on the program and gave us a chance. He was very straight with us, gave us a chance to say what we had to say. So for those of you who thought that a critical position towards capitalism is something that only a tiny number of people share, or that is unacceptable to Americans, that's not true. It's just not true anymore. So that it is really the case that if you share these critical perspectives, now is the time when you can't anymore blame the media or blame the system for not giving you a chance. Now it's on us because we got a chance. Biggest chance we've had in 50 years. Capitalism is in trouble. Its self-confidence is gone, and for good reason. And this is a chance then for other perspectives. If you are interested in any of the things I say and do, please note these two websites. The one, my name, rdwolff.com, where everything I do is posted. Or the other one, democracyatwork.info, where everything having to do with this new book, the one that we're going to have the meeting on October 9th, and the whole social movement to reorganize American enterprises, all of that is carried on that other website. Thank you again for coming. I only have time for one, but you have had your hand up. What was it?
It's quick and it's not a long answer. In front of the increasing privatization of America, and you're mentioning that politics can monitor economics, how is that possible when economics has bought politics already, except for the young people and the occupying ranks and so on, and all the other manifestations of needing a new structure altogether? How is it possible?
That's one of the signs of capitalism's weakness. You're absolutely right. The people with the money after the Citizens United and other decisions are in a position to buy everything. But this is the dialectic that Hegel and Marx taught us. The very fact that they can means that everything coming down from the heights of officialdom is no longer trusted. Everyone thinks they're being hustled by the Koch brothers or whoever it is you know who shelling out the money. It's exactly what happened in the Soviet Union. At a certain point, whatever came down from the top of the Soviet Union, the Russian people just assumed the truth must be the opposite of whatever it is they're telling us. Did they control all the media? Yes. But the very control brought about its opposite. The dominance by the United States has created it now that on any nighttime TV show, Jon Stewart, John Mayer, Colbert, even Letterman and the other apolitical types, the joke about the dominance of our politics by money is universal. Everyone knows it. Everyone knows this is a performance. Everybody who watched the Democratic and Republican convention understood this is a show to sell soap, except it's not soap, it's this candidate, or that candidate. We're all being sold. We're all being told that if you buy this soap and you use it under your arms, your sex life will be transformed. And we all giggle, like you just did, a giggle, ha, ha, ha. But we're doing the same thing with all of this news. That's why more young people get their news from Jon Stewart than they do from the regular news proposal, because it's more congenial, and they think it's probably more honest. And the fact is, it probably is. And that's when the money has destroyed its own effectivity by its rampant use. That has happened before in history. It's what's happening now. It's why people come and listen to folks like me, because they think they're going to get a better take on what's happening than all the rest of what's available to them. And that's half of why I'm successful. I'd like to believe it's because I'm a critic of capitalism. I don't think so. I think if I have some success, it's because I'm able, because I spent a whole life doing this, figuring out how to take the economic complexities and render them in a way that they're clear and logical and accessible to any halfway intellectually alert human being, which is what they should have been all along. That's my job. Translate gobbledygook economics back into something you can understand. People are so grateful for that, that my critical approach, okay, they'll listen to that too, but it's not the primary thing. I have to work longer to make it the primary thing so that we can have the kind of movement that can make the changes that I'm only talking about, but that need a movement to be realized.